This morning, I would like to give a brief kind of look into the data that hides out in our whole grain stamp database. And then we're going to look at the results of our most recent consumer insights survey, which was finished up in August. And then I want to talk about some ways that everyone in this room can help partner with us in pushing the momentum forward. So our whole grain stamp currently appears on more than 12,000 products, which are available in 60 countries around the world. And 25% of those products are actually available outside the US. And you can see that there's been a lot of international growth really in the last several years. I think overall, the whole grain landscape has changed significantly in the 13 years since we first released the whole grain stamp. And so it's really interesting to go back through that data and look at where those trends have taken us so far, because I think it has a lot to say about where things are headed in the future. I assume most of you are familiar with the whole grain stamp, but it's a tool that helps consumers identify products that contain whole grains, and it gives them a few different pieces of information. So the whole grain stamp lists the gram amount of whole grain per serving in a product, as well as telling you a little bit about the percent of grain that is whole grain. So we have a 100% stamp, a 50% plus stamp, and a basic stamp that kind of break that down. And one of the biggest changes that we've seen in the history of the whole grain stamp is an increase in the amount of whole grain that manufacturers are including in their products. So if we look back 10 years to 2008, the average product had 19 grams of whole grain, and today that's up to 25 grams. So I think that's very exciting. I think that's driven a lot by consumer demand and by product innovation from manufacturers who are making whole grains more and more delicious. This graph shows the increase in consumer consumption of whole grains in the US between 2004 and 2014. The whole grain stamp was released in 2005, so I think this data also gives you a pretty good sense of the impact that the whole grain stamp and other efforts of the Whole Grains Council have had on consumption here in the US. And of course, I want to mention that we did not do it alone. We have had great partnerships with manufacturers who have made creative product innovation, helping consumers to discover how delicious whole grains are. And we've also seen great efforts by RDs and health professionals and members of the media in communicating the health benefits to consumers and helping them understand why whole grains are such an important part of the diet. Also, just to summarize, the graph here, the last column, shows you the overall average increase, which was 50% over this 10-year period. So the momentum for whole grains is really an international, global trend at this point. I think as more countries are battling chronic disease, and as understanding of whole grains' impact on positive health benefits, positive health outcomes has really become more widespread, we're seeing interest not just from consumers, but also from government regulatory bodies looking for ways to promote public health. And two of the areas where we've seen the most impact or growth in recent years are Latin America and Asia. So this graph shows you the Latin American market and whole grain stamp use in Latin America. And it starts in 2010 when Grupo Bimbo started introducing products to the Latin American market. Today we have 27 member companies based in Latin America. And the trend in Asia has been similar, especially in the last couple years. There's been interest from places like China, where their government is looking at regulations and recommendations around whole grains. And today we have 7 member companies who are based in Asia. So beyond tracking just whole grain stamp use, our database also provides a lot of information about trends and changes over time. I think we've heard from many people in this room over the last few days about trends like ancient grains and sprouted grains. And those are trends that have really captured the attention of consumers and chefs. But we're also seeing that show up in the products that are coming to grocery shelves. In 2017, NPD Group released a report showing that shipments of ancient grains into food service had increased by double digits that year, 2017. And in this year, 2018, Euromonitor listed ancient grains as number 8 on their top food trends. And similarly, the National Restaurant Association named them number 20 out of more than 100 hot food trends. I think we're all familiar with quinoa's rise to fame. And we often get asked what we think is the next quinoa. And while we don't like to play favorites with grains here at the Whole Grains Council, it was very interesting to take a look at the prevalence of various ancient grain ingredients in the products that are being registered for the stamp, and see that both sorghum and teff have had really consistent growth over the last several years. So that's where I'm putting my money. And we've heard a lot about sprouted grains this morning. This is a trend that has been really kind of revving up in the very recent years. So it hasn't been around as a trend as long as ancient grains, but when we look at the number of products that are including sprouted grain ingredients, they've almost quadrupled in the last 6 years. And I think this is a trend that is really taking off right now. And I think as we learn more on the science side and we understand the benefits for human consumption, we're going to see this continue. So now I want to switch from talking about products to talking about consumers. We periodically conduct consumer insights surveys, which give us kind of a peek into the trends, the knowledge that consumers have about whole grains, and a sense of kind of their attitudes and behaviors in when they eat whole grains, what they like best about whole grains. So in August, we partnered with Qualtrics, and we surveyed 1,500 U.S. American, that's the same thing, American adults, and we targeted consumers who named themselves as one of the primary food purchasing decision makers in their household. And what we see is that whole grains really have become the new norm. So more than, or about 2/3 of consumers tell us that they make at least half their grains whole, which meets the dietary recommendations. And half of those tell us that they actually go beyond that they nearly always choose whole grains. And when we look at the group of consumers who are nearly always choosing whole grains, we see that they are telling us their consumption has increased over the last 5 years. So I think this shows that whole grains really are making traction, and that there's been consistent movement forward. Also, interestingly, despite all of the media hype about grain-free and low-carb diet fads, 96% of consumers tell us that their consumption of whole grains has either increased or remained steady over the last 5 years. So why are whole grains so popular? I think whole grains have had a very long-lasting reputation as healthy. And while we know very well from the other presentations we've heard that consumers don't always react well to kind of the health messaging as much as they do to the taste, I think we are seeing that change a little bit. And eating healthy foods is becoming trendier, and that includes whole grains. And as people begin to taste more whole grains, their palates are adjusting, and they are coming to really appreciate the fuller, richer flavor of whole grains. They're excited to learn that whole grains don't have, or that grains don't have to be this kind of tasteless blank slate where you have to add all these other flavorful ingredients to make something delicious. Whole grains can be sweet, they can be nutty, they can be peppery, they can be colorful, and consumers are really getting excited about that. Here you can see that as consumer understanding of the nutritional value of whole grains has risen, their appreciation for the taste has actually risen alongside it. So I think that says a lot about the need to get whole grains into people's mouths so they have a chance to try it, because as people eat more whole grains, they love them more and more. So one of the most popular questions we get at the Whole Grains Council is around the ancient grains trend. So I found it very interesting that when we asked consumers to name their favorite grain ingredients, ancient grains didn't actually make the list. It's our old-time favorites that remain at the top. So it's whole wheat, oats, and corn that are the top three. And this makes a lot of sense when you consider the fact that whole wheat bread, oatmeal, and popcorn are among the most popular ways to consume whole grains. We also asked consumers how often they choose whole grain versions of a whole variety of different food product categories. So we asked about bread, cereals, pasta, crackers, pizza crust, tortillas. And what we learned was that consumers are choosing whole grain options more frequently across almost every product category compared with their answers to the same question in 2015. There are a few things that still remain barriers for consumers. We talked a little bit about taste, and while a lot of consumers are really embracing the fuller taste of whole grains, some consumers still haven't quite made it to the point where they are craving whole grains. So I think that's an area where, we can keep talking about how delicious they are, keep showing new preparations that really include flavors that consumers are already familiar with and enjoy. While there have been many efforts by retailers and manufacturers to create price parity between whole grain and refined grain options, this remains something that consumers mention as a barrier, the cost issue. So I think that's something that we can continue to work on as an industry. And finally, availability. Consumers tell us that they just don't feel like they have as many options as they would like when they go to their local grocery store or their favorite restaurant. 92% of consumers tell us that they are most likely to choose whole grains when they are inside in their home, eating at home. And I think that's because this is where consumers have the most control over their food choices, and so that makes it easiest to choose whole grains. We know that the availability of whole grains in food service is an area that has seen lots of growth recently, and I think this remains one of the biggest opportunities for changing consumer behavior. We know that consumers are eating out of their homes a lot more, And so I think that the more whole grains we can get into restaurants and food service settings, the better. A big reason that ancient grains are so popular is because of the story behind them. We've heard many people mention the importance of telling that story, giving people information about the history, giving them a sense of how their food, which feels so personal to so many people, connects with who they are, how they see themselves, how they interact with the world. In the US, quinoa is obviously still one of the front runners, but interest in ancient grains overall has seen a large rise. And perhaps the most surprising result of our survey is that while very few consumers in the US have heard of fonio, which is a whole grain out of Senegal, those who have tried it almost always listed it as one of their favorite grains. So that was a pretty exciting finding. Our survey found that consumers still have a lot of confusion about gluten. While half of Americans have some sense of what gluten is, meaning that they answered one of the two correct answers on our survey, only 6% of consumers correctly identified gluten both as a protein found in wheat, barley, and rye, and as something that helps bread dough to stretch and rise. Although 1/4 of consumers told us that they have cut back on gluten, 94% said that they eat gluten some or all of the time. And the number of consumers who told us that they avoid gluten completely due to a medical diagnosis was just over 1%, which lines up with the numbers that Kathleen showed yesterday, the 1 to 2% estimate of celiac disease prevalence in the general population. I am going to end my results about the survey with some information about the stamp. So awareness of the whole grain stamp has steadily increased since its release, and consumer trust in the information that the stamp provides has never been stronger. 4 out of 5 consumers tell us that they trust the whole grain stamp to give them accurate whole grain information about the whole grain content of the product. And 78% say that they would use it as part of their decision making when deciding about whether to buy a product. Half of those respondents said they would also consider factors like sugar and sodium, but that the stamp would be a part of that decision. And finally, I would like to invite every person in this room to join us for Whole Grain Sampling Day, which is the next big event here at the Whole Grains Council. We host this one-day event every year, the last Wednesday in March. So it will be March 27th in 2019. And this is a great opportunity to really showcase the flavor of whole grains to consumers. So the idea is that consumers, as they go about their day that day, will find whole grains wherever they go. And they'll see grains that maybe they have never heard of before, or that they haven't had a chance to try, or they'll see it in a different way that they haven't thought to prepare it in. The idea is that we want to give consumers an opportunity to really have that aha moment where they realize, man, where have whole grains been all my life? I should be eating these all the time. So we partner with organizations and manufacturers and RDs all over the country for this event. We have lots of ideas for ways to participate. We've seen big sampling events. We've seen workshops about whole grains. We've seen increased food options available at colleges and universities. Some manufacturers do giveaways on social media. There are a myriad of ways to participate.